Welcome into the WholeHog Podcast. Seth Campbell bringing you all of today's great content, and we're going to start off today with an interview with Richard Davenport. Richard covers recruiting for WholeHogSports.com and the Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette as well. You probably read him somewhere if you read something about recruiting. So, Richard, thanks so much for joining us here on the WholeHog Podcast.
Thanks, Seth. Looking forward to it.
All right, so the past decade, when you think about recruiting in the past decade, there is one story that really stands out above all of the others, and that is the Alex Collins story with his mom taking his national letter of intent. I've really wanted to know more background information about this. So, Richard, do you have some more information about that?
Well, I mean, he lived with his high school coach, Doug Gatewood, and so he had a relationship with his parents, but not not the normal relationship. And when it came time for him to make a decision, obviously he picked Arkansas and was planning to sign with Arkansas. And she grabbed the national letter of intent and took off with it. And that obviously was something that he wasn't expecting, and delayed his signing with Arkansas a day or so, best that I can remember. And his dad ended up signing the national letter of intent. You have to have a guardian or an adult, or somebody that's that you're associated with in order to make it official. And so his dad stepped in and did that, and Alex was kind of embarrassed by all the attention and all that. But the people that I was talking to before before all that happened, I mean, he was set on Arkansas, and even when his mother got the national letter of intent and took off with it, I mean, that wasn't going to sway him any. The people that I was talking to said it was just a matter of time for him to be able to set it up and make it official. And he ended up doing it at a local restaurant with his dad signing. So, it created some drama, especially probably more so for the Arkansas fans, because they were worried that somehow that maybe the local school, Miami or somebody else, might be able to sway him, but that wasn't the case. I mean, he was I'm not going to say he was for sure coming all along, but I've always felt like Arkansas was in the driver's seat because of his previous relationship with Brett Bielema at Wisconsin. And then once he visited Arkansas, I mean, I think he fell in love with it. But that was obviously a big deal and a lot of drama for the Arkansas fans. I don't think necessarily for him, because he was pretty locked in to being a Hog.
When you say his mom took his national letter of intent, do you know the, details around that? Were they at a signing party and she ran off with it? Did she just take it without him knowing? Do you know any of that?
That's been, what was it, been about 7 years ago? I can't remember all the details. I think it might have been at the school, and she came up and again, I don't know this for sure. I just know that she obviously took the national letter of intent, but I'm thinking that she might have went up to the school and grabbed it and just ran off, but can't say for sure.
That's just a wild story. And as you said, I remember, that did gain a lot of publicity. I think ESPN picked that up and wrote a story, or it was on their website or something. That is not an everyday happening where somebody steals a national letter of intent and just runs away with it.
No, I mean, you've had some parents and guardians disagree with a kid's decision, but as far as just grabbing the paperwork and just running off, no, I don't think that's if it has happened, it obviously didn't get as much attention because Alex was considered definitely one of the top prospects in the country, and when you're a high-profile guy, when something like that happens, you're going to be written about, and obviously that made the national news, and I think if anything, it embarrassed him, and he didn't like that type of publicity, but that was short-lived. Obviously, once he signed with Arkansas, and everybody knew he was going to be a Razorback. I'm sure he looks back on it now and kind of, not really proud of it, but at the same time realizes, sometimes there's a few bumps in the road of life, and that was one of them.
Great story there, Richard. We're talking to Richard Davenport, writer for WholeHogSports.com. Another guy that had a unique path to the Arkansas Razorbacks was Hjalte Froholt. That's a guy that you don't normally think about coming from a different country, coming in and playing for the Razorbacks. What can you tell us about his recruiting?
Well, Hjalte obviously is, because of his background. He's from Denmark, but he was an exchange student, and he went to high school as a sophomore. Went to high school in Ohio, and I remember him just initially being a tight end, defensive end, and very athletic kid. I think he was around 250, 260 his sophomore year, and then he obviously kept growing. But it was just kind of odd to see a guy come from a country that they play what he calls club ball. It's not that high schools there don't play football, but more like club ball. And so when he wanted to pursue football, and he wanted to do that obviously in the United States. And when he first started getting recruited or noticed, it was at the high school in Ohio. And then Coach Bielema was here at the time, and he developed just a super relationship with him and his parents. But I just really admired, and I always told Hjalte, I always admired him because I know when I changed schools when I was a kid, I was always nervous and shy about having to meet new friends. But here's a guy that going from one country to another to pursue his dream, and really just being focused on that, and really embrace the challenges of going to a different country, different culture, and learning football in a more specialized way, because obviously the coaching in Denmark, I'm sure, is pretty good, but most of those guys are really trying to learn from YouTube, or if they play or they maybe have known some American football coaches or something like that, and they've learned through them and through YouTube, I imagine, and then he comes over here, and it's just football is just so big in the United States, and he really embraced that, and it was pretty neat getting to know his mom and dad, his sister, and his brother, and just seeing him go from an exchange student to an all-SEC offensive lineman to now with the New England Patriots, and seeing how big that was to the family and to the country of Denmark. Denmark, that was a big deal when he was at Arkansas, because that playing in the SEC, that was a big deal for the whole country. There were several articles written about him back home, and I think some people, and maybe a lot of people, remember that he was a very, very highly recruited kid. Initially, people thought because he was going to high school in Ohio State or Michigan or somebody like that would be where he would end up. But eventually he went to IMG Academy in Florida his senior year. But he visited Ohio State, he visited Michigan, he visited Alabama, he visited Florida State. He could have gone anywhere in the country, but he chose to be a Razorback, and that was a big deal, because he was, I think most people realize how raw he was at Arkansas as an offensive lineman, because he was basically recruited as a defensive lineman, and he switched over after his freshman year. And I think that his upside is tremendous, and he's really still learning the game, and his development as an offensive lineman, I think, is going to be key for his longevity in the NFL, because he's got all the tools. But it was just really neat seeing him and how happy he was, playing American football, and his family coming over from Denmark, on a fairly regular basis. That a lot of times they would come over, especially his dad would come over for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and then fly back home. So it was much of an unusual situation because of most of the time your family's just driving a few hours away to see you play or visit you, and obviously they had to fly across the pond, so to speak. So it was pretty neat.
Talking to Richard Davenport here on the WholeHog Podcast. Richard, who was a recruit that you saw during this past decade that may have not been the most highly regarded recruit, but you said, hey, that guy's going to pan out, and then he did, at the University of Arkansas?
Excuse me. I imagine there's quite a few, but I guess one that just comes to mind right now would be Jeremy Sprinkle. I remember seeing him on film. He played tight end, defensive end at Whitehall, and just seeing him on film. And I told his dad, I said, man, I really think he's got a shot to be a very good player in college. And because of his frame, he was 6'5", 6'6", about 225, maybe 230 coming out of high school, and obviously developed in the 250, 260 range at Arkansas. And he looked, from a physical standpoint, looked like a freak. I mean, he really did. He's a great looking kid at tight end, and obviously developed over his time in Fayetteville. Shared a lot of snaps with Hunter Henry. So he really didn't get the notoriety until his senior year. But you could tell that he had the potential. After probably his sophomore year, you thought, okay, this guy has a chance to go to the NFL, and that's where he is right now. So that was kind of neat. And I remember his dad sending me YouTube videos, and I was telling him I really do think Jeremy's got a shot, and he comes from a football family. Obviously, his brother Aaron was I think an All-American at OBU. I thought he could have played major college football, to be honest with you. I thought he was overlooked, but he was an outstanding football player at OBU. Then Daniel, he was an outstanding football player, but he chose baseball. So all three brothers were great athletes, and couldn't come from a better family. His dad, Billy, is just a great guy. Probably one of the more unassuming fathers I've run into. He never pushed his son, like saying you really need to look at him. You really need to write about him or anything like that. Billy's as good of a guy as that you ever want to come across, and I still stay in touch with him.
Good stuff, Richard. All right, that was kind of over the past decade. Now, 2020. Is going to start fresh for the Razorback football team with head coach Sam Pittman. And Pittman has hired his staff now, and he's even put out recruiting territories for his staff. What do you expect from this recruiting class, and what can you tell fans to expect from this recruiting, this recruiting staff is what I'm trying to say here?
As far as the 2020 class, I think Coach Pittman's been honest about it. And I think, whenever I talk about the possibilities of how it could eventually end up. When you're hired and you only have 4 or 5 days really to get your first set of kids on campus for official visits, and the early signing period takes away so many potential athletes or recruits, because about 70-75% of them sign in December. So you're really looking for right now, and not all kids are like this, but you're really looking for several kids that are maybe flying underneath the radar, not getting a lot of attention, and I think they've done that with some of the kids. But you just do the best you can, and then start focusing on next year's class, because that's really when you're going to make a difference as far as in the program, as far as your ability to bring in some difference makers. And I still think that they have some guys that are going to play next year and make some make an impact, but not as many as you normally would when you have a year or two to develop relationships with kids and parents. So I've, Chad Morris, his first class, he had to deal. His first year he had to deal with the early signing period, first ever signing period. In his first class, according to ESPN, was number 51 in the country. Right now, Coach Pittman's class with 15 guys in the class versus what Morris had. He had 17. His class currently right now is ranked number 49. So I figure that the class could be maybe a top 40 class. And if you do that, considering all the obstacles that you faced, I think it's pretty good. But going forward, I'm very, very optimistic about the future.
Pittman is known around the SEC as a great recruiter as we continue to talk to Richard Davenport here on the WholeHog Podcast. What makes him such a great recruiter, Richard, from everything you've heard?
Well, you talk to the kids, you talk to the parents, and he just has that ability to communicate and make you feel important and make you feel like that he really truly cares about me as an athlete, and really cares for my son. If I'm talking from a parent's perspective, and he's just able to connect with people and be believable, because let's face it, there's a lot of coaches that just they come across as fakes, and I hear that from parents and high school kids on a regular basis. And when you find somebody that comes across as very genuine, very caring, and has the best interests of your child or you as a prospect, that's huge. And in my 14, 15 years of doing this, I don't think I've ever come across a coach that when I talk to kids and parents, that they talk so highly about a particular coach like Sam Pittman. And obviously Arkansas has had quite a few coaches over the last 10, 15 years, as far as assistants and as far as head coaches. So for him to be the guy that I hear so much about and people have so much respect for, it just comes down to how you treat people, and when people know that you're genuine, and when you see former players wanting him to be the coach at the University of Arkansas, that tells you that not only does he care for you when he's recruiting you, but he cares for you when you get on campus. And I can talk about Frank Ragnell. I remember talking to his dad before he passed, that I think it was the week of the Alabama game. Frank's freshman, maybe might have been his sophomore year, can't remember. But I remember Frank's dad saying that, at the time Frank was having a nagging injury, and just every day that week, Coach Pittman and Coach Bielema both, but Coach Pittman would call him as they were getting off the practice field and was telling him, hey, he's really progressing, just giving him an update about how he moved. And I remember his dad saying, well, Sam, I really appreciate you calling me and all that, but man, you guys got to get ready for a football game. He was just blown away by Coach Pittman and his willingness to keep him informed about how his son's doing and his well-being, and that his dad just loved Coach Pittman, and obviously Frank did too, and still does. So he just has that way of connecting with people, and obviously the type person he is, he treats them well during the recruiting process, when they're on campus, and after they're done playing for him, he still stays in touch with the kids. And also, you've got to include Jamie, his wife, and Jamie being such a mother figure to so many of those kids, and the parents just rave about her too. So it's really Sam Pittman and Jamie both.
Good information there, Richard. We'll let you go, but before I do, I want to ask you, how does Sam Pittman, the relationship builder, the great recruiter, how do you think that's going to translate over with him being the head coach now?
Well, only time will tell. The way I look at it, obviously this will be next season will be his first time to be a head coach during a season. There's going to be a lot of first times for him, as far as having to make decisions, and how he does in that area. We don't truly know, but I tend to think because of his longevity in college football, there's been plenty of times in the past where there's been instances where, say whoever he was working for at the time, the head coach would make a call, and in the back of his head, in the back of his mind, he was thinking, well, that would have been the call I would have made, or I probably would have done this a little different. So he's probably seen just about every type of situation that he'll be faced with, but instead of being a guy that's kind of just being an assistant and being in charge of the offensive line, he's going to be over the entire team, be over all the coaches and the whole program, and he's going to have to make those decisions on his own and within a split second. And that we don't know how he's going to do in that area. I tend to think he's going to do pretty good. And then he obviously has Barry Odom, a coach that's been there, done that at Missouri, to rely on. So I think that's really huge too. So all in all, I think things will be good going forward. But at the same time, I'm sure there'll be some times when he'll look back and think, well, I probably should have done this a little differently. But I think he surrounded himself with veteran SEC type coaches that have seen what the league's all about, and there's not going to be any wow moments for them because they've been there and done that so many times. So I think with the experienced staff and having Barry Odom to bounce things off of, I think he'll do fine.
I know I said last question there, Richard, but while you were talking, something got brought up that I think a few Razorback fans are kind of curious about. So I want to ask you this, and then I promise I'll let you go. Sam Pittman doesn't have any native Arkansans on his coaching roster right now out of the 10 guys that he has on staff. Are you at all worried about that?
I thought that there might be one, and now let's remember that Barry Loney Jr. had an opportunity to stay on the staff, but he didn't because he wanted to spread his wings and obviously be an offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, and he wants to advance his career, and that's why he went to UT San Antonio. But I think with Sam, he's a guy that obviously was here for 3 years. He knows the state probably maybe better than most because he always came back to the state and for vacation. He and Jamie have bought a lot on Lake Hamilton to where they're going to retire. So he's been around the state enough to know the ins and outs, but at the same time, I think he knows if there's anybody that he needs to reach out to and maybe get some advice. I'm sure there's plenty of people that he knows that he can reach out to because it just his background at Arkansas and also just his being familiar with the state, and he's made so many friends, coaching wise and just regular normal friends too.
Richard, I appreciate your insight. Great stuff today. Thanks for coming on.
All right, buddy. Take care.
You too. That's Richard Davenport for WholeHogSports.com. We will link some of his stories below in the description of the podcast, along with anywhere else, so you can make sure to check them out there. They will be in the story. So make sure to check out Richard's stories about Alex Collins and Yalta Froholt and some of the stuff that he's written about the upcoming staff. Welcome into the WholeHog Podcast. Seth Campbell, and we joined along now Drew Davison, writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And Drew, let's get right down to it. TCU coming into Fayetteville, and they're going to be coming in off of a huge win over Texas Tech this week.
Oh, yeah. I mean, TCU desperately needed a win. They had two blowout losses at West Virginia and then struggled again. So they had to get back on track and did so last night against Texas Tech, a big win over a top 25 team. And really they kind of fixed some of the things that were not going right for them. That they were struggling from 3-point range, so they kind of got back on track there. They had to get Desmond Bain going. So certainly they'll be going up to Fayetteville with a little bit more momentum than their last two losses.
TCU had a fantastic start to the Big 12 season, winning their first 3 games in the Big 12 against Iowa State, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State. Is this a team that you can see themselves playing their way into bubble talk and into the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I do, and I think they're kind of like last year. They were right on the bubble. This year, in last year, the chairman said they were kind of left out because their road record didn't look too good. And things of that nature. And this year they were able to pick up a win early at Kansas State. They've been a little bit more competitive on the road, but a game like at Arkansas is really a game that could be, one of those bubble games or, whether it's a quad 1, quad 2 and whatnot, but just in terms of the road record and being able to boost that and make that look better, that's important for TCU. But I do think, at the end of the day, they're a pretty competitive, talented Big 12 team. And I'd say the Big 12 is a little more top-heavy this year compared to last year where, maybe only 5 or 6 teams get in as opposed to 7 or 8. But I do think TCU can put themselves right in that conversation if they're able to handle their business.
TCU coming into Fayetteville, Arkansas has had a tough time on the boards. Arkansas starts their tallest starter, if they keep the same lineup, is only 6'6", and that's Adrio Bailey. What does TCU do on the offense and defensive end, and are they going to be that big rebounding presence like Arkansas has had trouble with?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly going to be their game plan going into Arkansas is to try and use some of their size to really set the tone. And when you talk about TCU and the post depth, it starts with Kevin Samuel, their big 6'10", really kind of grown each year he's been at TCU. This is his 3rd year. He's a redshirt sophomore, and his post moves just get better and better. And he's a rebounding threat, of course, with his size and length. So they really need him, to have a big game up there in Fayetteville. And he poses a lot of problems, I will say. He also struggles from the free throw line. So I would not be surprised if Arkansas does some sort of a hack-a-shack type of thing to slow down Kevin Samuel. But the other big guy that, TCU's hoping to have a breakout game is a kid named Jaden Ledee. He transferred from Ohio State, got immediate eligibility, but he's kind of known as a rebounding threat, and they really need him to have a big day on the boards up there as well. And then, the other offensive threat, like I said, Desmond Bain, their senior guard. He's a potential 3-point specialist in the NBA. If he makes it in the league, that's probably what it will be as. So, he can really change the game. They're 7-0 when Bain scores at least 20 points, so they need to get him going early and often against the Razorbacks.
Talking to Drew Davison, writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. 7-0. That's a good stat there, Drew. Thanks for dropping that on us. TCU, we talked a little bit about if TCU can make the NCAA tournament here. Where does TCU rank in your mind in the Big 12 and with teams like Baylor and Kansas?
I think they're kind of, right now the middle of the pack. They are truly, obviously you got your Baylor, West Virginia, Kansas as kind of the 3 clear-cut favorites. And then, clearly Texas Tech was right in that mix, but they lost to TCU. But I think, when you look at TCU and Iowa State, Oklahoma State, Texas Tech. It's kind of jumbled right there, with kind of that mid-tier team. So the big thing for TCU and contending for NCAA tournament, they just can't go and get blown out by 30 points or 20-plus points like they did at Oklahoma. I mean, they have to, be competitive, play competitive. So, that's really the key. But I do put them right in the middle. And if they're on their game, if Desmond Bane's hitting his shot and getting looks, TCU can, play with just about anyone in the country.
Talking to Drew Davison, writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Drew, this SEC Big 12 Challenge is right in the middle of conference play for both of these conferences. What's your opinion on that?
Personally, I think it's a nice little break from conference play. I know the SEC is structured a little differently, but the Big 12, you got it's a 10-team league, so you play nine home games, 9 away games, and I think it sets up well in terms of strength of schedule and come for March Madness in the committee perspective. But I do think it's nice to see a different city, see a different team if it's at home, just kind of change it up. And I think it's a good measuring stick for both leagues. It's like, hey, how's our top teams faring? How are the bottom teams faring? You can just kind of tell, maybe where the league is, how strong it is with how they handle it. Whereas early season, it's kind of hard to judge just because, there's so much roster turnover these days. But at this point in the season, teams are kind of what they are. So I think it's a real good measuring stick for both leagues.
I would be remiss, Drew, if I had you on here and we didn't talk a little bit about what happened this week with the Kansas State thing. What's going on in the Big 12 with that?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. Definitely, I will be interested. Or last I checked, I hadn't seen any formal punishment or what's going to happen, but certainly not a good scene for college basketball, especially the Big 12. And that is a heated rivalry, Kansas and Kansas State. It's a lot, like some of the SEC rivalries, if you will. But yeah, I mean, there's no place for that, and you got to hope that both teams can move past it and whatnot. But certainly an ugly look for the Big 12 and Kansas State.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Drew. All right, before I let you go here, Drew, as we're talking to Drew Davison of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, you mentioned that this is a big game for TCU coming into Bud Walton Arena. It's been a while since they visited. Do you think that they will bring out anything special, anything new that you haven't seen yet from the Horned Frogs?
Well, like you said, I really think we're going to see a bigger emphasis on the boards. I mean, TCU always wants to win the rebounding battle like every team, but kind of like you said, with the smaller Arkansas lineup, I do think, maybe they'll go bigger and they haven't really started that Jaden Ledee, who I talked about earlier, or whatnot. So maybe they try and go bigger as opposed to a smaller lineup, just depending, if they feel they can exploit that matchup more than on the perimeter.
All right, Drew, great information. Thanks so much for joining us here on the WholeHog Podcast.
Oh, anytime. Thanks for having me on.
As I said, that's Drew Davidson. He's a writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. You can check out his stuff on the Fort Worth Star-Telegram website. And Arkansas versus TCU coming up this Saturday. Getting you ready here on the WholeHog Podcast. The WholeHog Podcast is produced and edited for airship by me, Seth Campbell. Special shout-outs to Drew Davison and Richard Davenport. You can read more from Drew on the Fort Worth Star-Telegram website. You can read more from Richard on WholeHogSports.com. If you like this podcast and want to hear more great Razorback content, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss upcoming news. If you're looking for more great Razorback basketball content, then check out the Basketball Podcast of Mid-America. The podcast comes out on this channel, so you don't have to go anywhere different to hear about the Hardwood Hogs. Scotty Bordelon joins me to give you detailed analysis of the Hogs' past games, as well as preview the upcoming game. So make sure to check out the Basketball Podcast of Mid-America. Theme music for the WholeHog Podcast is by Silent Partners. I'm Seth Campbell for WholeHog Sports. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week.